Hello again, everyone. Uh, Today we're kicking off our discussion of Plato's ethics and political philosophy. And as you see down here, some of the themes we're going to be discussing are justice, the good life, and a city run epistocratically. So these are some of the sort of main focuses of Plato's ethics and political philosophy. There are other things we can talk about. We could go more in depth on each of these three than we're going to in this lecture. There's simply just not enough time to dive into literally everything that Plato said on these topics. But we're going to hit the major themes today, and we're going to start out by looking at two primary questions. And the first is, what is justice? And this is a search much like we've seen in all the other dialogues, right? So whether it was the Euthyphro looking for piety or the Meno looking for virtue, this is the same idea. Right? Socrates and his interlocutors are just interested in defining this term, justice, finding out what the definition or universal truth is, or objective truth is, or reality of justice is. And we'll see one of the main reasons they become interested in answering the question, what is justice, is because this other question arises. Why is it better to live a just life than an unjust life? So all three of the interlocutors that Socrates is working with here question whether it's better to live a just or unjust life. Thrasymachus actually goes so far as to say the unjust life is clearly a better life to live, where the other two, Glaucon and Adeimantus, are sort of just playing the devil's advocate here. But Thrasymachus really believes that the unjust life is better than the just life. So let's see why that might be, right? So just before we get into their actual views, think about this a little bit intuitively. If you had the choice between a just life and an unjust life, which one would you live? Socrates is going to claim the just life is better, but is this really the truth, right? Sure, we don't want to be evil people, but should we always be just, or would it help us sometimes to violate those rules and be a little unjust? Right, so if we were unjust, we wouldn't have to sacrifice our desires or happiness in order to serve justice. You wouldn't have to worry about the common good. You could worry about yourself. If you don't have enough money for that, I don't know, let's say they don't have iPods anymore. If you don't have enough money for a new laptop or computer, right, just go ahead and take it, right? Your life will go better if you just steal that laptop than just avoid it because you're too poor to afford it, right? So it seems like being unjust in that scenario would actually help your life go better, right? You'd have that laptop that you want that you can't afford if you just stole it. And if you always act from justice, it seems like you're going to improve others' lives, but it's going to come at a cost to your own life. Right? So isn't justice really just a burden for us? Acting just all of the time seems to be burdensome. It seems to keep us from getting all of the things we want, and it seems to not hinder our lives, but it seems to make it harder to realize the things that we want. Okay. So let's see. They start trying to define justice, and here is Thrasymachus' definition. Roughly, he says, I say that justice is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. So there's his definition. And the reasoning is as follows. The rulers declare what they have made, what is to their own advantage, to be just for their subjects, and they punish anyone who goes against this as lawless and unjust. This, then, is what I say justice is, the same in all cities, the advantage of the established rule. Since the established rule is surely stronger, anyone who reasons correctly will conclude that the just is the same everywhere, namely, the advantage of the stronger. So what's he saying here? Well, clearly the advantage of the stronger is pretty clear, but what's his reasoning? Well, he says, look, when we look at examples of justice out in the world, right, we see a clear example when we discuss the city and its laws. And so we say the laws serve justice and obedience to law is a just thing. But then think about that, right? Every type of government, from democratic to tyrannical, says the same thing about their laws, even though their laws vary wildly, right? So the democracy puts a bunch of laws in place. It says those laws serve justice and that you are just when you obey. The tyrannical government does the same thing. They put laws in that they claim serve justice and that is just to obey. So these things vary too wildly to be globbing on to the same like overall or underlying essence of justice, right? It's realizing it in many different ways. We can't say democracy is just and tyranny is just, right? So there's got to be something underlying both of these systems when we say that their laws are just and obedience to them serves justice. So what we're saying here is justice is simply the rulers using their power to enforce laws that are to their own advantage. So justice is basically a construct of the state or the government, right? And the rulers. It's a construct that the rulers create and put in place. And Thrasymachus says it's to sort of solidify their own power, right? It's to the advantage of themselves. It's an advantage of the rulers or the stronger. So that's why justice is really just the advantage of the stronger. Now Socrates comes back and says, look, but don't rulers sometimes give orders that are to their disadvantage? Right, so we don't see this often in the U.S., but if a president increased taxes on the wealthy, most presidents are pretty wealthy, most senators are pretty wealthy, right? They would end up increasing taxes on themselves. So let's say a ruler did that. There have been presidents and senators in history, obviously, who call for those things, right? Those rulers would be giving an order that's to their disadvantage. Right? If they didn't put that in, they get to keep more of their own money, but they're doing it. So it seems like that's to their own disadvantage. Well, why would they do this? Socrates says the only reason a ruler would give an order that's to their own disadvantage is because ruling is really for the good of those ruled. Right? So the ruler is doing things for the good of his or her subjects. Right? So really, rulers don't always do things that are to their own advantage, contrary to what Thrasymachus is saying. So sometimes obedience to law is for the advantage of the ruled and not the ruler. So that means justice is not always to the advantage of the stronger. Sometimes justice is going to be to the advantage of the weaker. So your definition is wrong, Thrasymachus. We need to move on. They keep sort of pushing around a little bit, but ultimately they say, okay, look, let's not define justice. There's another sort of more important question that we're all worried about here. Is the just life better than the unjust life? And given that Thrasymachus believes that the just life is simply the advantage of the stronger, it's pretty clear what route he's going to take here. Thrasymachus is going to say the unjust life actually ends up being better for the individual than the just life. And let's see why that is. So Thrasymachus says, therefore I repeat what I said before. A person of great power outdoes everyone else. Consider him if you want to figure out how much more advantageous it is for the individual to be just rather than unjust. Those who reproach injustice do so because they are afraid not of doing it, but of suffering it. So, Socrates, injustice, if it is on a large enough scale, is stronger, freer, and more masterly than justice. Okay, so you might be slightly confused here, right? Where he says it's much more advantageous it is for the individual to be just rather than unjust. But that's sort of like a sarcastic comment toward Socrates, right? Look at how much more advantageous it is for the individual to be just rather than unjust, right? He's saying, look at that person. You're going to clearly see them losing, right? Because if somebody does injustice on a large enough scale, like a ruler would, then they're going to get away with everything they want, right? Their situation is going to be stronger, freer, and more masterly than anybody who is trying to embody the principles of justice. So really, they're not going to go this far, but justice really looks something more like power, right? And so being unjust, being able to use that power is going to lead to a better life than one in which you restrict your power by acting justly. So yeah, there's the rough idea, right? In other words, when we commit to a life of injustice, we'll be able to get more of the things we want, and our life will go better. Like my example with the laptop, if you want a piece of technology but can't afford it, just take it. If your neighbor's dog is barking nonstop, right, and bothers you, wakes you up every morning, just set it free. Your life will go better. Who cares about what your neighbor's going through? Who cares about their bond with their dog, right? Your life will go better if you just set that thing free. Don't like your mom? Light a bag of dog poop on her porch on Mother's Day, right? Show her who's boss. The idea here is that you'll be happier, right, when you get to do these actions, because your life will go better by acting in this unjust way. Now, keep in mind here, we're working in the abstract, right? We're working at a theoretical point about which is better, the just or unjust life. In our world, there's going to be a lot of people, most people probably, who avoid injustice because they're scared of punishment, right? So the only thing holding them at bay from being an unjust person is that they're scared of punishment. So yeah, you wouldn't take that TV or let your neighbor's dog loose in real life because you don't want to get caught, but Thrasymachus is saying in the abstract, right? If you could get away with these things, then you would do it. And so injustice is clearly a better life to live. And that's why rulers get away with these things all the time, because they won't be caught, right? They can get away with these things because they're the ones who set the rules of the game. And Socrates responds in the following way. Right? So come then, and let's consider this. Is there some function of a soul that you couldn't perform with anything else? For example, taking care of things, ruling, deliberation, and the like? Is there anything other than a soul to which you could rightly assign these and say that they are its peculiar function? Thrasymachus. No, none of them. Well, what of living? Isn't that a function of the soul? It certainly is. And don't we also say that there is a virtue of a soul? We do. Then, will a soul ever perform its function well, Thrasymachus, if it is deprived of its own peculiar virtue, or is that impossible? It's impossible. Doesn't it follow then that a bad soul rules and takes care of things badly, and that a good soul does all of these things well? It does. Now we agreed that justice is the soul's virtue, and injustice its vice. That we did. Well, then it follows that a just soul and a just man live well, and an unjust one badly. Okay, that's a long thread. It's probably a little difficult to follow, but what's he saying there? Well, the idea is that everything has a unique function, right? Every object out there has a unique function. They go through examples of knives in the dialogue, right? You could use any knife to peel the skin off an apple, right? But there are knives that are made specifically for that job, right? There are knives that better serve that function. It is their unique function. And so that's what he's saying here about the soul. The soul is just another thing like that. The soul has to have a unique function. And for the soul, that unique function is reason, deliberation, taking care of things. And it can't perform that function well unless it has its virtue. This is just something they agree on previously in the dialogue. That the virtue of the soul is justice. So a good soul reasons and takes care of things well because it is a just soul, right? If the soul has a function that it can't perform without its virtue, well then if it is performing its function, that's because it has its virtue, right? So it is performing its function, it's reasoning well and taking care of things, that's because it has its virtue. It's a just soul. So that means the man with the just soul lives well, and so the just life is better than the unjust life. So saith Socrates. Now, one important point here is Thrasymachus could have done a little bit better in defending himself, but instead he just sort of capitulates and lets Socrates run the discussion. And Socrates identifies the just with some type of proper psychological functioning or rationality, right? So a human soul has this virtue of justice, and somehow justice has something to do with you functioning properly psychologically. Right? So when we have our rationality, we're somehow exercising that virtue of justice. And that's it for Thrasymachus. We'll see what Glaucon and Adeimantus have to say about Socrates' view here in the next video. Thank you.